What impact will Jamal Khashoggi's murder have on the Middle East? The US says it's undermined stability. The Saudis describe the global outcry over the killing as hysterical. So who's the real catalyst for turmoil in this volatile region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey is threatening the stability of the entire Middle East. That's the view of the US Secretary of Defense James Mattis, who says Washington's ready to take more action against those responsible. Visa bans are already in place for 21 suspects in the case. Saudi Arabia is under mounting pressure to explain exactly what happened at its consulate in Istanbul. It's reported that the evidence links the murder of Khashoggi directly to the office of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a charge Riyadh denies. We'll get to our guest shortly, but first let's hear from the US Secretary of Defense from a conference in Bahrain.
When people can speak and be heard calling for peace and for respect for all, the terrorist message of hatred and violence is not embraced. With our collective interests in peace and unwavering respect for human rights in mind, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in a diplomatic facility must concern us all greatly. As U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo stated, the United States does not tolerate this kind of ruthless action to silence Mr. Khashoggi, a journalist, through violence. Failure of any one nation to adhere to international norms and the rule of law undermines regional stability at a time when it is needed most. As President Trump noted, we're going to get to the bottom of it.
At the same conference, Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Al-Jubeir criticised media reaction to Khashoggi's murder, urging people not to jump to conclusions.
This issue has become fairly hysterical. I think people have assigned blame on Saudi Arabia with such certainty before the investigation is complete. We have made it very clear that we are going to have a full and transparent investigation, the results of which will be released. We have made it very clear that those responsible will be held responsible and will be held to account. And we have made it very clear that we will put in place mechanisms to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Turkey wants the suspects extradited to stand trial in Ankara, but Al-Jubeir says they'll be dealt with in Saudi Arabia.
On the issue of extradition, the individuals are Saudi nationals. They're detained in Saudi Arabia. The investigation is in Saudi Arabia, and they will be prosecuted in Saudi Arabia.
Let's bring in our panel. Joining us in Doha, Majed Al-Ansari, Professor of Political Science at Qatar University. In Kuwait City, Shafeeq Ghabra, Professor of Political Science at Kuwait University. And in Washington, D.C., Hillary Mann Leverett, former U.S. State Department and White House official. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start with you, Hillary Mann Leverett, in Washington, D.C. Regional stability is threatened. That's the view from the U.S. Secretary of Defense. What does he mean by that?
That's a good question. There is not a lot of certainty here with the messages coming out of the administration, whether it's Secretary Mattis in Bahrain very recently or the messages coming out of Secretary of State Pompeo or President Trump himself. But for Secretary Mattis to say that the killing of Jamal Khashoggi represents potentially a threat to regional security is an almost unprecedented statement from a U.S. Secretary of Defense about Saudi Arabia. That kind of language is usually almost always reserved for, in today's age, for Iran or, decades ago for Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So it's an unprecedented use of the term to threaten regional stability. Whether that means that Saudi Arabia is an immediate, imminent threat that could be the subject of a United Nations Security Council resolution, or it's just Secretary Mattis trying to lay down the marker that Washington and the White House are very upset about Saudi behavior, that's unclear. But it is an almost unprecedented phrase to use about Saudi Arabia coming from Washington.
Majed Al-Ansari, what do you think of the Secretary of Defense's comments? Hillary there said it was, almost unprecedented to hear that kind of language. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. And it's certainly quite peculiar that this happens in Bahrain, and effectively a proxy of Saudi Arabia. This happening there, with the defense secretary saying this very bluntly on the stage, shows that there's a clear indication by the Trump administration that unless the Saudis take real initiative in solving this issue in a matter that would save face for the American administration, as it would for the House of Saud, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that there are a couple of messages that went out from the White House, from Mattis, now Pompeo before that, and even the way that the administration has been dealing with this on a diplomatic level, it is very clear that the Americans are quite unhappy with what's happening. They cannot sweep it under the rug as they usually do, and they need the Saudis to do something about it.
What does that something look like, Hilary Mann-Leverett, to you? What does that something that the US administration should do? What does that look like?
Well, that's also a question that is being debated for the first time in my memory, and I've served in and out of the U.S. government for more than 25 years. It's the first time that there is a real discussion, a sharp discussion in Washington about what to do about Saudi behavior. We did not even have a discussion like this after the 9/11 attacks back in 2001. But for the first time, you have people on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, in the Senate, like Senator Lindsey Graham, essentially calling for regime change. And he's not the only one. You have voices like that on Capitol Hill. You have some of those even within the U.S. intelligence services and even within the U.S. Defense Department. This is really an unprecedented level of discussion and a really critical eye towards Saudi behavior. And it's that the Jamal Khashoggi killing in itself is horrific, but that the concern is that it's really the last straw, that Saudi behavior under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whether it's toward Yemen, towards Qatar, toward Canada, Syria, the whole range of issues, is an example of, or really the epitome of reckless behavior that endangers U.S. interests. So in terms of what the United States is going to do or can do, the options are not, they're not great for the United States. There's concern here about losing or derailing the economic relationship, the military relationship. But for the first time, there is a real question about whether the United States can continue to support the ascension of Crown Prince Mohammed to become king. That is really an unprecedented discussion inside Washington. Again, usually reserved for discussions about Iran or decades past about Iraq under Saddam Hussein. But that is one of the questions being discussed. The other is what other kinds of sanctions can be imposed that would not hurt the United States economically. There really aren't that many. Are there any other kinds of diminution of visits, for example, to not have as many political or military visits? And again, Secretary Mattis going to the region, going to Bahrain, not going to Saudi Arabia is an important signal of U.S. unhappiness, but there's not that much the United States can do practically that's under discussion here. The real remarkable thing is that there's even discussion in polite company about whether or not the United States can support the ascension of Crown Prince Mohammed to become king of Saudi Arabia.
Let's bring Shafeeq Ghabra in here from Kuwait City. We seem to be hearing that the options are limited for the US in terms of what they can actually do. We're also hearing that it's very difficult to support the ascension of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to the royal throne. What's your view? Do you think the options are limited, or do you think the US needs to get tough and stop the ascension of the Crown Prince?
It's very hard to say in what direction things will go. But all I can see is that the assassination, the way it happened, of Jamal Khashoggi has opened an entire panoramic situation that so many questions are asked. And this does have regional implications on human rights. If you go back to 2011, the Arab populations wanted change, wanted democracy, wanted participation, wanted to have a say, and wanted to be able to say their opinion and yet be protected. And that particular Arab Spring was massacred brutally, was kind of a counter-revolution came against it. So what happened with Jamal Khashoggi tells us that human rights is a major issue in the Arab world and today in Saudi Arabia.
Majed Al-Ansari, let me bring you in here. It seems to be that there are several discussions going on. There is the human rights violations, there is ascension, there is what the US can really do. Does this present Qatar with an opportunity to really press its case when it comes to the blockade, for example, with the US and with Saudi Arabia? What is Qatar's view here?
Well, let me just say one thing in the beginning, which is that it's very difficult to link the two cases together, the assassination of Khashoggi and the blockade in Qatar. Many people have been trying to do that through saying that Saudi Arabia has requested Qatar to mediate between it and Turkey. I don't see this happening. There's no easy explanation for these rumors, but there certainly seem to be only rumors. However, certainly a halt to the Saudi and Emirati project in the region is going to be beneficial for Qatar, one of the victims of Emirati and Saudi, let's say, movement in the region. We've seen how the Saudis and the Emirati blockaded Qatar. We've seen how they went to war in Yemen, how they've done a lot of things in the region. However, it will certainly be beneficial for Qatar if there is, some tightening up the ropes around Saudi Arabia, and especially around Mohammed bin Salman himself. However, it is also reminiscent of the Lockerbie moment for Gaddafi and Al-Hariri moment for Hafez al-Assad at the time. It's not unprecedented, meaning that these two incidents also occurred in a similar fashion. The new thing here is that this is happening not with a leader that has been there for a while, that has been understood to be against Western doctrine, against Western wishes, but this is somebody who's a close ally to Washington, who's a close ally to the West, who considers himself to be a reformer, who's marketing himself actually in the West as somebody who can exact change in Saudi Arabia that will make it more similar to the Western context. So for Qatar, certainly it is a chance to alleviate some tensions in the region. However, there is no direct contact between what is happening to Saudi Arabia now and the situation with Qatar.
Well, let's take a look at the region. Global attention's been focused on a number of issues in the Middle East. Now, that includes the war in Yemen, which began in 2015 and has Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates heading a coalition fighting Houthi rebels, leading to what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Last year, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt and Bahrain imposed a land, sea and air blockade on Qatar, which continues today, threatening the unity of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And tensions been growing between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with each other accusing the other of interfering in Arab countries' internal affairs. So when we are taking a look at everything that the Saudis are doing, I just want to ask you this question. If it doesn't present an opportunity with the US, does it present, Majed Al-Ansari, an opportunity with Saudi Arabia? Is there rapprochement available? Can the blockade be lifted through something like this?
Well, if I was designing Saudi policy, and thankfully I'm not, but if I was doing so, I would certainly consider this to be a very difficult moment in time to enact such change in the Qatari file, because it will be looked at as a complete failure of Saudi foreign policy in all respects. The Khashoggi thing on one side, going down from the tree on the Qatari issue on the other hand. I would actually strengthen my resolve to continue the blockade on Qatar. However, we must not forget that this also is very close now to the conference or the meeting that the GCC leaders and Trump will be having in January, things that we have been hearing now for a while. And I think only 2 days ago, the Kuwaitis actually assured that this will be taking place. So certainly the Americans would like to pressure the Saudis now to come down from the tree, to lessen its procedures against Qatar, to rethink its position towards the region. However, as things stand right now, I think the Saudis and the Emiratis will be very keen on establishing a very specific and strong stance against Qatar, because they don't want this to be looked at as a complete, return from their policies. We can also see that during the past couple of days, there were a lot of talk about a change in rhetoric coming out from Saudi Arabia. We've heard the Crown Prince talking about Qatar as an economic success after, of course, Saudi media spent a year and a half talking about Qatar's economy failing altogether. We've seen now also Adel Jubeir today calling the crisis with Qatar a diplomatic conflict rather than a crisis or a boycott, as it was called by him before. So there is a change of language there. The Bahrainis today, for example, said that there is nothing banning joint families between Qatar and Bahrain visiting each other. All this changing language, I think, is just paving the way for the January summit rather than talking about real change in the crisis status quo.
I'm very keen to hear all of your thoughts on some of what Majed Al-Ansari has said, but let's talk about the Saudi Foreign Secretary in particular, Adel Al-Jubeir. He's actually called this, the world's reaction to Khashoggi's killing, as hysterical. I want to begin with Shafeeq Ghabra in Kuwait City. Hysterical? What do you make of that kind of language?
I see in Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry a lack of diplomacy and a lack of even visibility. I mean, as you all did follow, it took several weeks before there was a statement after the Khashoggi disappearance. There was a lot of instability in the way the policy was even expressed. What happened stage by stage? So it's unfortunate to say the reaction is hysterical, yet it is very understood. There are events in history. I recall the assassination of Mr. Aquino in 1983 after 3 years of exile. And he was told to come back to his country, the Philippines, and he was assassinated in the airport. A whole movement erupted, and later on his wife, who was a housewife then, not interested and not involved in politics, led a movement and then became the elected democratic president of the Philippines in 1986. So there are events in history, and assassination can always go in that direction, human rights. But when it is coming together with the war in Yemen, the blockade with Qatar, the entire episode with Canada, the situation that happened with Lebanon, other aspects and other issues of human rights and princes and other members of the Al Sauds and others in the business community in Saudi Arabia, human rights issues, one day, someday, is going to become quite a reaction. And I think it was building up, and unfortunately, it was Khashoggi, a dear friend and a very gentle human being and a very wise man who always expressed what is always good for Saudi Arabia and for the region in a democratic human context. Unfortunately, it took his life to create a kind of opening for the whole idea of freedom of expression and representation, and to deal with all these kind of unfortunate and very archaic type of conflicts that erupted in this part of the world as a result of policies that were very adventurous in the last 3 years.
Hilary Mann-Leverett, we've heard some very extraordinary diplomatic language over the last 3 weeks coming from Turkey, Saudi Arabia and the US. But for me, the use of the word hysterical by the Saudi foreign minister suggests that either they are wanting to calm things down but don't have the diplomatic tools to be able to do that perhaps, or this is just trying to get to a place where they can go to the January summit and something can be done. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the Saudi reaction, Foreign Minister Jubeir's comments about essentially the U.S. reaction being hysterical, because he said that he said that immediately after Secretary of Defense Mattis took Saudi Arabia to task for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi on the stage in Bahrain. Foreign Minister Jubeir of Saudi Arabia said it was hysterical right after Secretary Mattis spoke. So to me, it was a not so indirect rebuke of Secretary Mattis personally. And it's not an isolated reaction from the Saudis that's very critical of Washington. There have been other Saudis who have essentially threatened to send the price of oil to $200 a barrel, who have essentially threatened to give a military base to Russia inside Saudi Arabia. Those reactions from Saudi Arabia are adding to the discussion here in Washington that, especially under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia cannot be America's sole reliable strategic pillar in the Middle East. And that is leading not only to a question of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's ascension to become king, but it's also for the first time prompting some in Washington, and I wouldn't say this is widespread, but some in Washington to rethink the U.S. relationship with other key players in order to balance Saudi recklessness in the region. So, for example, to get closer perhaps to Qatar, to get closer to Turkey, to get closer even perhaps to the Islamic Republic of Iran, that these three countries in the region represent not an anti-Saudi movement, but a balancing, potentially balancing series of countries that the United States can have a better relationship with in order to not have so much control and so much recklessness coming out of Riyadh. So those two things, I think, are coming together. The Saudi reaction to Jamal Khashoggi's murder is even more important strategically here in Washington than perhaps the murder itself, because it draws this real question mark about Saudi Arabia as the one and only strategic pillar for the United States in the region, of course, with the Israelis, but today those are coming together somewhat. But to look again at Qatar, Turkey, and Iran as key countries to balance Saudi Arabia's recklessness.
We are running slightly out of time. I do want to bring you both in from Kuwait City, Shafeeq Ghabra and Majed Al-Ansari. I'll start with Kuwait City. The idea that perhaps a better alliance for the US would be Qatar, Turkey, Iran would have seemed fanciful just 4 weeks ago. But now there are some circles in DC apparently discussing that. Do you think that's a better alliance for the US than, say, perhaps relying solely on Saudi Arabia?
Well, let me first say that the US need to bring back into the core of its policy, and that should apply US, Congress, the entire operation has to absorb again the whole issue of human rights in the region. Because with human rights and the violations that have existed in the last decade or two are very much directly responsible, among other factors, definitely, to the rise of violence and instability in the region. So A, human rights. B, I think the US has to look at each state differently. So I would say there is quite a conflict on so many issues with Iran. Come back to the nuclear agreement. Try to bring this back to the table in a sensible way and create a win-win relation with Iran. There are differences with Iran. There are issues with Iran, even in the Arab world at large, from Syria all the way to other places. But it shouldn't be a zero-sum situation. It shouldn't be zero-sum. It must get to the point where a dialogue between the Gulf and Iran can take place, and the US could encourage that at one level or another. Now come to Qatar. Yes, I believe the US has to strengthen its relation to Qatar, to Kuwait, strengthen its relation to Oman, strengthen its relation to anybody in the region. And I see the need for balance and the need for reasonable thinking and a policy that is not adventurous. And there are plenty. There are many leaders in the region. Kuwait is one of them. Qatar is another. And should find a way to stop the Yemen war, because the Yemen war is a tragedy. It is a tragedy ongoing daily, with many killed civilians more than anything else. Destruction of an entire nation. And who's going to rebuild Yemen?
Let me just bring in Majed Al-Ansari here. We are running out of time. I do apologise for that. But very quickly, you've heard what our guest in Kuwait City has been saying. What are your thoughts? Does the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US need to be reset? And should it pivot towards Qatar and Iran?
Let me be more of a pessimist here, Imran. I think very clearly the United States' problem with Saudi Arabia is not that it killed a dissident. I'm sure that the American administration understands that many of the regimes, the repressive regimes in the regions here, kill dissidents every day. The problem is how it was managed and how, as the president said in a couple of days ago, that the silly cover-up, the very stupid cover-up that took place. This is the main problem. The problem is that their ally cannot manage foreign policy, cannot manage its actions in a way that will save face for the administration itself. I think for the United States, the important thing is to have an ally that is dependable. And certainly, countries like Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar have shown themselves to be quite dependable. We're seeing now the Omanis stepping up their game through their mediation, the Palestinian issue, for example, and as they have done before between the Americans and the Iranians. So I think the Americans now understand that Saudi Arabia is not a reliable ally. However, it is very difficult to break up that strategic alliance between Saudi Arabia and the Republicans especially. in the United States. What will happen now, I think, is that there will be a diversification of diplomacy when it comes to the Americans.
We are going to have to end it there. Thanks to all our guests, Majed Al-Ansari, Shafeeq Ghabra and Hilary Mann-Leverett. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.